All right, so today we're taking a deep dive into the American Revolution. You sent over some fantastic material on this, and I gotta say, I'm pretty pumped to get into it.
It's a big one.
Yeah, it is. Big topic, huh? It looks like we've got a chapter straight up titled The American Revolution, and another source that seems to be covering similar ground.
Lots to dig into.
Yeah, definitely. So the goal here is to go beyond just like, the basic redcoats versus rebels story, right?
Right.
We want to really understand like the internal conflicts, the different motivations, the lasting impact, all that good stuff.
Yeah, I think one of the things that your sources really emphasize is that it wasn't a simple, unified front against British tyranny, right? There were layers to this conflict.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like it wasn't just about independence. It was about like who even was an American, right? What did America stand for? All these big questions, like did everybody even want independence? And what happened to the folks who didn't fit this, this image of the ideal American citizen? That's fascinating.
Absolutely. Those are great questions. And I think those are some of the things that make this deep dive so interesting, right? We're going to be looking at all those competing visions for America, the actual realities of war for both soldiers and civilians, and the long-term consequences of this revolution for various groups, right? Enslaved people, Native Americans, women, all those voices that sometimes get lost in the bigger narrative.
Absolutely. And one thing that both sources point out is that the American victory wasn't just about like military might, right? They talk about a really important shift from like conventional warfare to a war of liberation.
Yeah, I think that's a really key distinction, right? Because in a conventional war, you're trying to, defeat the enemy's army, right? You want to crush them on the battlefield. But in a war of liberation, you're fighting for the hearts and minds of people. It becomes about legitimacy, the right to govern, right? So that shift, I think, was essential for the Americans because they needed to prove, not just to themselves, but to the world that they were worthy of independence, that their cause was just...
Okay, so how did they make that case? How did they get people on board with this idea? What convinced people that this fight was actually worth all the sacrifice?
Well, I don't think it was a sudden realization. It was a gradual process driven by a lot of events, ideas, and the actions of key individuals. Your sources point to, the Second Continental Congress in 1775 as a really critical moment.
Okay.
Remember, this is right after those clashes at Lexington and Concord, right? So tensions are high. But even at this point, not everyone is on board with complete separation from Britain.
Yeah, so you got a divided house, basically.
Very much so, right? You have the pro-independence faction, figures like, John and Samuel Adams, Richard Henry Lee. These guys are pushing for a complete break. But then you also have, folks like John Dickinson leading this reconciliation faction, hoping for a peaceful resolution, right? That they see this as a dispute over rights within the British Empire, not a reason to completely sever ties.
It's wild to think that this turning point, there's still so much uncertainty about the future.
Yeah.
So what was it that finally tipped the scales towards independence?
Well, your sources highlight a few key events that really dramatically shifted public opinion. One factor was the British strategy of recruiting, Native Americans, enslaved people, and even German mercenaries, the Hessians, to fight against the colonists.
Oh, wow.
This really shocked a lot of Americans because it suddenly turned the conflict into something much more brutal and personal.
He's like seeing people you considered countrymen fighting alongside like people you considered enemies.
Yeah.
That's like a betrayal.
Absolutely. And then you have Lord Dunmore's proclamation in 1775. This offered freedom to enslaved people who joined the British forces, and this created a moral and strategic dilemma, particularly for the South, where, slavery was deeply entrenched.
Yeah. I mean, that's huge. On the one hand, you have this potential for personal liberation for enslaved people, right? But on the other hand, it exposes this deep hypocrisy at the heart of the patriot cause, right? Like, how can you fight for liberty while denying it to others?
Absolutely. And then on top of all of this, you have the British blockade of colonial ports, which had this devastating economic impact, right? It disrupted trade, caused all sorts of shortages, and really fueled a lot of resentment towards British policies.
So you got this like perfect storm brewing, right? You've got moral outrage, economic hardship, and this growing sense that reconciliation is just not possible.
Right. And the final straw comes in July 1775 when King George III rejects the Olive Branch petition. This was this last-ditch effort by the colonists to reconcile with the crown.
Right.
And its rejection really signaled that there was no turning back, that war was basically inevitable.
Okay, so now, like, the stage is set for revolution, but how do you convince an entire population that's used to being, loyal subjects of the crown to embrace this radical idea of independence?
Well, that's where Thomas Paine and his incredibly influential pamphlet Common Sense comes in, published in January of 1776. He just dismantles the idea of monarchy and aristocracy, arguing that hereditary rule is inherently unjust and that Americans deserve self-government.
It's a bold move, right?
Oh, yeah.
Going against centuries of tradition.
Absolutely.
So did it work?
It was a sensation. Common Sense sold over 100,000 copies in just a few months, and it really reframed the fight for independence, not as this act of rebellion, but as this righteous struggle for freedom and self-rule. It captured the aspirations of, everyday Americans and helped legitimize the cause on a global stage.
That's incredible. That's like, imagine the impact of having that message spread so widely.
Right.
It's like the social media of the 18th century.
Absolutely. And it laid the groundwork for the Declaration of Independence, which was adopted just a few months later on July 4th, 1776.
Okay, now things are getting really interesting. Because the Declaration isn't just a list of complaints, right? It's a statement of principles. It's a blueprint for this new kind of nation.
Absolutely. And your sources point out its direct connection to the Enlightenment thinker John Locke and his idea of natural rights,
Right.
life, liberty, and property. But Jefferson, who's the primary author, he makes this subtle but really important change. He replaces property with the pursuit of happiness,
Oh,
which suggests this much broader vision for American society, one that really prioritizes individual fulfillment and well-being.
yeah, that's fascinating because it suggests that it wasn't just about, like, political independence. It was about creating a society that actually fostered individual opportunity and happiness.
Absolutely. And it had an immediate impact. I mean, states started drafting their own constitutions, right? Establishing these Republican governments rooted in the consent of the governed.
Wow.
And this paved the way for the Articles of Confederation in 1777, the first attempt to, unite the states under a national government.
So we've gone from these, like, hesitant steps toward resistance to a full-blown declaration of independence and the creation of a new government.
That's a lot.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
But declaring independence is one thing. Actually winning a war against the most powerful empire on earth, that's a whole other story.
Yeah, that's where the real challenges begin. I mean, the sources paint this vivid picture of the logistical nightmares, the financial struggles, the sheer grit it took to mobilize for this war. The Continental Congress had no power to tax.
Yeah.
They tried issuing paper money, which quickly became worthless because of rampant inflation.
The perils of printing money, it's like a tale as old as time.
Oh, yeah, it always comes back to bite you.
It does.
So how did they actually finance the war? Well, they relied on borrowing from other nations, particularly France, who saw this as an opportunity to, weaken their rivals, the British.
Right.
But even securing those loans wasn't easy, and the Continental Army constantly struggled with shortages of supplies and equipment.
And it wasn't just about money, right? Like,
Yeah.
recruiting and maintaining an army, I can only imagine that was a constant headache.
Absolutely. Initial enthusiasm waned as the realities of war set in. I mean, they had to resort to offering bounties, land grants, and even drafts to fill the ranks. And you're talking about mostly untrained militiamen facing off against these professional soldiers of the British Army.
Man, talk about an underdog story, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's incredible they were able to pull off a victory.
And a huge part of that was leadership. Both sources really emphasize the crucial role of George Washington.
All right.
He wasn't just a military strategist, he was a unifying figure, someone who inspired trust and confidence in the middle of all this chaos.
Yeah, he's like that steady hand at the helm, right?
Absolutely. And under his leadership, along with, the contributions of foreign military experts like the Marquis de Lafayette and Baron von Steuben, they transformed those ragtag militias into, a fighting force capable of challenging the British.
Okay, this brings up another interesting point.
Yeah.
We talked about Lord Dunmore's proclamation and the dilemmas it created. But did Black Americans actually fight in the war?
They did, on both sides of the conflict. Initially, even Washington was hesitant to arm Black soldiers.
Wow.
But the need for manpower ultimately outweighed those concerns, those prejudices.
That's really, it just shows how deeply ingrained these prejudices were, even among those who are, like, fighting for liberty, right?
Sadly, it does. But despite facing discrimination and this inherent contradiction of fighting for a nation that denied them full equality, Black soldiers made some really significant contributions.
Yes.
You have figures like Crispus Attucks, one of the first to fall at the Boston Massacre.
Right.
You have Salem Poor, commended for his bravery at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Their stories remind us that the fight for freedom had many layers, right? It wasn't just about national independence, it was about personal liberation as well.
Yeah. Their courage in the face of all that, it's really inspiring. It speaks volumes about the complex and often contradictory nature of this whole revolution.
And that's what makes it so fascinating to study. I mean, it wasn't this simple, straightforward path to victory.
Yeah.
It was this messy, chaotic process, filled with human drama, strategic blunders, moments of brilliance, and a whole lot of luck.
Sounds like we're just scratching the surface here.
Oh, yeah.
I can't wait to dive into the actual battles and campaigns. Is that where we're headed next?
Absolutely. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of the battlefield, we need to understand the British perspective. I mean, they initially saw this as a localized rebellion in Boston that could be easily crushed. They had no idea what they were really up against.
Oh, I bet they learned their lesson pretty quickly.
They did.
Is that where we'll pick up in part 2 of our deep dive?
It is. Get ready for a wild ride through all the major campaigns of the Revolution. We'll look at the strategic decisions, the turning points, and the unexpected twists and turns that ultimately led to American victory.
I'm on the edge of my seat already. Can't wait to hear more.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the American Revolution. Last time we talked about the road to independence, right? All those early stirrings of discontent and those big events that led up to the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah.
Now we're actually going to step onto the battlefield.
I am so ready for some action. I know the British underestimated the colonists at first, but I'm really curious to see how that played out in the actual fighting.
Yeah, well, as your sources described, those early stages of the war were full of miscalculations on the British side.
Okay.
They thought they could just, squash the rebellion with a show of force, a few decisive victories.
Right.
They really didn't understand how determined the colonists were or the challenges of fighting in this new American landscape.
So where did things really start to heat up? Where was like the first big clash?
It all began in New England, mostly around Boston. The British saw that as the heart of the rebellion, the place where they needed to really reassert their control. But events like the Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775, they quickly shattered that illusion.
Oh yeah, I remember learning about Bunker Hill in school.
Yeah.
Wasn't that like a Pyrrhic victory for the British? Like they won the hill, but at a huge cost.
Exactly. The sources describe these staggering casualties that the British suffered way more than the colonists.
Wow.
And it sent a clear message, right? This was not going to be easy.
Right.
The colonists were willing to fight hard, even against, these incredible odds.
Yeah, that's a serious wake-up call for the British.
It was?
So what did they do next?
Well, realizing that Boston was pretty vulnerable and strategically not ideal,
Yeah.
they evacuated the city in March 1776
Okay.
and relocated their forces to Halifax, Nova Scotia. But the Americans weren't just sitting around. They actually tried a pretty bold move of their own. An invasion of Canada.
Wait, they tried to conquer Canada?
They did. It was a gamble. They hoped to capture Quebec and get the French-Canadian population on their side. They did manage to take Fort Ticonderoga, but ultimately failed to capture Quebec and suffered some setbacks and casualties in the process.
Okay, so it sounds like a bit of a mixed bag for the Americans in those early stages, right? Some wins, some losses, but definitely this growing sense that this war could go either way.
And that's exactly what worried the British, right? They realized they were up against something much bigger and much more determined than they had initially thought.
Right.
Yeah.
And this brings us to the summer of 1776. A pretty big moment with the Declaration of Independence, fresh in everyone's minds.
Absolutely. And the focus of the war shifts to the mid-Atlantic, especially around New York City. The British, under General William Howe, they arrive with this massive force intending to really make a statement.
Man, I can only imagine what it must have been like for the colonists to see all those British warships just filling the harbor.
Oh, yeah, it must have been terrifying.
Like just this overwhelming force.
The sources talk about the sheer scale of the British operation. Hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of troops. I mean, it was a display of military might unlike anything they'd seen.
Wow.
And Howe, confident in his, overwhelming advantage, He offered Washington and his troops a chance to surrender, receive a royal pardon.
Okay, did they take the deal?
No way.
Okay.
The Americans, driven by, revolutionary fervor and this deep belief in their cause, they refused to back down.
Right.
They were going to fight for their independence, even against these seemingly insurmountable odds.
Man, talk about courage under fire.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the battles that followed were some of the most intense of the entire war. The British, with their superior numbers and training, they pushed the Americans out of Manhattan, Long Island, forcing them to retreat across New Jersey into Pennsylvania.
So it was a pretty bleak time for the Continental Army.
It was desperate. But Washington's leadership was really crucial here.
Okay.
He realized he couldn't win a conventional battle against the British. So he had to come up with this bold, kind of risky strategy. Surprise attacks, strategic retreats, just trying to wear down the enemy and buy time.
So he's playing the long game.
He is. And it all culminates in this stunning victory on Christmas night, 1776.
Okay.
When Washington leads his troops across the icy Delaware River and launches this surprise attack on the Hessians at Trenton.
Oh, the famous crossing of the Delaware, like that iconic image.
One of the most famous images in American history.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just symbolic. I mean, it was a turning point in the war. It boosted American morale, showed their resilience, and it really shook the British, forcing them to rethink their strategy.
It's like a Christmas miracle. So did this success turn the tide of the war? Like, was it all uphill from there?
Not immediately, but it set the stage for a series of strategic moves that would eventually lead to that American victory.
Okay.
The British, frustrated by their setbacks, they regrouped. They decided to focus on capturing Philadelphia, the colonial capital. They succeeded in 1777, but it was a very costly victory. And ultimately pretty pointless.
Why pointless?
Well, because while they were busy occupying Philadelphia, things were happening further north that would have a much bigger impact on the war's outcome.
Oh.
Remember that plan the British had to divide the colonies?
Oh, yeah.
To cut New England off from the rest?
Yeah.
Exactly. General John Burgoyne was supposed to lead this army south from Canada,
Right.
while Howe moved north from New York.
Yeah.
But Howe, maybe overconfident after taking Philadelphia, he abandoned that plan, leaving Burgoyne to face the Americans alone.
Oh, that's a major blunder.
It was a huge mistake. And the Americans, under General Horatio Gates, they saw their chance. In October 1777, they surrounded Burgoyne's army at Saratoga, New York, and forced him to surrender.
The Battle of Saratoga, yeah. I mean, that's considered one of the most important battles of the whole war.
Absolutely, a decisive American victory and a turning point. It not only showed that they could beat a major British force, but it also convinced France to formally join the war as their ally.
Wow, so now it's a global conflict.
Exactly, and that French alliance was crucial.
Right.
They provided, desperately needed money, military supplies, and naval power, which would eventually help to trap the British at Yorktown.
Okay, but before we get to that dramatic finale, I want to talk about the Southern campaign.
Okay.
The British shifted their focus down south, hoping to kind of take advantage of loyalist sentiment, get a foothold there. How did that play out?
Well, the sources describe this really complex and brutal fight in the South,
Right.
marked by, intense fighting, guerrilla warfare, and these constantly shifting allegiances. The British had some early successes, capturing Savannah in 1778 and then Charleston in 1780.
Wow.
But they really overestimated how much loyalist support there was and underestimated how challenging the Southern terrain and the climate would be.
Yeah, the South is a whole different beast.
Oh, it is. Those swamps and forests, very difficult, especially for an army used to fighting in, open fields in Europe.
Right.
And the British faced this relentless enemy in the Southern Patriots who used these guerrilla tactics, these hit-and-run raids, to really disrupt their operations.
Yeah.
Figures like Thomas Sumter and Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, became legendary for their daring attacks and ambushes.
Like the American Revolution's Robin Hood.
Yeah, fighting from the shadows, striking fear into the hearts of the British.
I love it.
And maybe the most unexpected twist in the South was the impact of slavery on the conflict. The British, thinking they could exploit tensions, offered freedom to enslaved people who joined their side.
Right.
But this actually backfired. It made white Southerners even more determined to support the revolution.
Wow, talk about unintended consequences.
Yeah, it's a perfect example of how complex the issue of slavery was during this time.
Yeah.
It reveals those anxieties of Southern slave owners, those fears of rebellion, the loss of their property. Right.
And it shows how even those who might have been sympathetic to the British, they ended up supporting the Patriots out of self-preservation, this desire to keep things the way they were.
So it's another layer of complexity to the conflict, right?
Absolutely.
Highlighting those moral dilemmas, those deep divisions within American society.
Yeah, and all of these things, the military blunders, those surprising alliances, the whole issue of slavery, the rise of guerrilla warfare, it all comes together in this final act of the revolution, the Yorktown Campaign.
This is it.
This is it.
The big showdown, right?
The climax.
The one that seals the deal for the Americans, secures their independence.
Exactly. In 1781, General Cornwallis, facing a lot of pressure in the South, he moves his forces north to Virginia,
Okay.
intending to set up a stronghold at Yorktown.
Okay.
But the Americans, with their French allies, they saw an opportunity to trap him. It was this brilliant strategic move, coordinating troops from New York and Virginia and using the French Navy to block British reinforcements.
So they basically boxed him in. Totally. Cornwallis and his army were completely surrounded, outnumbered.
Wow.
And after weeks of siege with no way out, he surrendered on October 17th, 1781.
What a moment. I mean, you could practically hear the cheers erupting across the colonies as the news spreads.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm guessing the story doesn't end there.
You're absolutely right. Winning the war didn't automatically mean peace and independence. There were still negotiations, treaties to sign, and the huge task of actually building this new nation.
Right. The real work was just beginning.
It was.
I can't wait to hear what happens next. Is that where we'll pick up in part 3?
You bet. Get ready to explore the challenges of winning the peace, figuring out a new government, and understanding the lasting impact of the revolution on American society.
We're back for the final part of our American Revolution deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of crazy to think we started with those first rumblings of discontent, and now we're here, after a full-blown war and a huge victory at Yorktown.
Yeah, it's been quite the journey. But as you might have guessed, winning the war was just the first hurdle. The really tough part was creating a lasting peace and building a nation that could actually live up to all those revolutionary ideals.
Yeah, the sources really highlight this sense of uncertainty and possibility after the war, right? It's like they've climbed this huge mountain, but now they have to figure out how to get back down and actually build a new life.
That's a great way to put it. And there were some pretty treacherous paths along the way.
Right.
There was still this sizable loyalist population, those who had stayed loyal to the ground throughout the whole conflict. What happens to those folks in this new America?
Yeah, both sources mention how difficult it was to bring everyone together, all those divisions that lingered after the war. Some loyalists faced some serious consequences, right? Like persecution, property being taken away, even violence.
Yeah, it was tough.
A lot of them chose to just leave, head to Britain, Canada, other parts of the British Empire.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that revolutions, even when they're for a good cause, they're always going to be winners and losers.
Right.
And it takes time, a long time, to heal those wounds, to rebuild trust, to create a sense of shared identity. It can take generations.
And it wasn't just about, reconciling with those who opposed the revolution. The new nation had all these other challenges, right? Like setting up a stable government, creating a solid economy, navigating all those tricky international relationships, and of course dealing with those issues we talked about before, like slavery and Native American rights.
Right. So many things to tackle.
So much. Where do we even begin?
Well, let's start with the peace negotiations. The British, after Yorktown, they were ready to come to the table.
Okay.
But the Americans, as your sources point out, they were determined to get the best possible deal for themselves, even if it meant going against their French allies.
Oh, interesting. But I thought the French were instrumental in the American victory.
They were, but the Americans were also a little wary of becoming too dependent on another European power.
Makes sense.
They had just fought to break free from one empire. They didn't want to get tangled up with another one.
Totally, yeah. So how did those peace talks actually go down?
The American delegation, led by John Adams, Benjamin Franklin and John Jay, they did something pretty bold.
Okay.
They negotiated this preliminary treaty with Britain in 1782 without even telling the French.
Wow. Risky move.
It was a gamble. It could have backfired, but it worked. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, officially recognized American independence and gave the new nation this huge territory stretching from the Atlantic all the way to the Mississippi River.
That's a massive win. They got their independence and all this land for future expansion.
It was a huge achievement. It really set the stage for that westward expansion that would define so much of American history.
Right.
But it also raised some tough questions about the Native Americans who were already living on that land.
Yeah, that's a question that America is still grappling with today, right?
Yeah.
How to reconcile those ideals of liberty and self-government with the displacement of indigenous peoples.
It's a complicated and often tragic story.
Yeah.
And the sources talk about the challenges Native Americans faced after the Revolution. They had lost a powerful ally in the British, and now they were dealing with this new nation that wanted their land.
Did the new government try to address like Native American rights at all?
They did make some attempts, but those efforts were often limited and often undermined by the pressure to expand westward.
Right.
They negotiated treaties, but those treaties were often broken or manipulated to benefit white settlers.
This constant tension, right, between these high ideals and then the reality of power and self-interest.
Absolutely. And you see that same tension when it comes to slavery.
Right.
You know, the revolution sparked these debates about whether slavery was morally right, but did it lead to any real change?
Yeah, good question.
Well, the sources kind of paint a mixed picture.
Okay.
On the one hand, you have the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, the idea that all men are created equal.
Right.
And you see these abolitionist movements starting, especially in the North, where some states actually take steps to get rid of slavery or phase it out gradually.
So there's hope,
Right.
like that the revolution might actually lead to a more just and equal society.
Yeah, there's a glimmer of hope there. But that hope is overshadowed by the reality that slavery is still deeply rooted in the South,
Yeah.
where it was seen as crucial to their economy and way of life. And even in the North, those prejudices, they didn't just disappear overnight.
Right. It's a good reminder that revolutions don't just magically fix centuries of injustice, right?
Absolutely. They might create the conditions for change, but real change takes time.
Yeah, it takes time.
And sometimes it faces a lot of pushback from those who benefit from the way things are.
Right.
You see that in the debates over the Constitution, those compromises that were made to protect slavery,
Yeah.
it delayed a real reckoning with the evils of slavery.
It's fascinating how these moral dilemmas shaped the founding of the nation.
Right?
They were trying to build this government based on liberty and equality,
Right.
but they were also willing to compromise on those principles to keep everyone on board.
Exactly. It shows the tension and the contradictions that were at the heart of this whole American experiment.
Yeah.
They were trying to create a more perfect union, but they were also wrestling with the legacy of their past, all those prejudices and inequalities that would continue to shape American society for generations to come.
So it's a story of progress, but also setbacks, right? These high ideals, but also the harsh realities.
Yeah, it's both.
And it's a good reminder that the American Revolution wasn't just one event. It was a process,
A long one.
this long journey towards a more just and equal society.
A journey that continues today.
Absolutely. It's incredible, studying history. It's not just about memorizing dates and battle.
It's about understanding people.
It's about understanding people, the choices they made, the challenges they faced, the legacy they left behind.
It's about connecting the dots between the past, the present, and the future,
Yeah.
and understanding that the story is never truly over.
I love that. And with that, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the American Revolution. We've covered the causes, the key figures, the major battles, the political and social upheavals, and really the lasting legacy of this pivotal era in American history.
We've covered a lot of ground.
It's been an amazing journey. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of the revolution now, its complexity, all thanks to you and, of course, the fantastic sources you brought to the table.
Well, thank you for having me. And remember, this is just the beginning.
It is.
Keep asking questions, keep challenging assumptions, and keep diving deep into history. There are so many stories waiting to be discovered.
Couldn't agree more. And thanks to all of you for listening to this deep dive into the American Revolution. We'll catch you next time. Welcome to The Deep Dive. Today we're diving into the American Revolution,
Oh, yeah.
but not the one you might find in a textbook.
No.
We're going to go beyond the battlefield today,
Absolutely.
exploring the roles that women played,
Yes.
the challenges of building a new republic, and the conflicts that arose as the nation expanded westward.
Yeah, it's a fascinating period.
So much happened.
It really laid the groundwork for so much of American history.
For sure.
And we're going to see the seeds of debates that continue to this day.
Yeah. And uncover some stories that you might not have heard before.
You got it.
Okay, let's start with the women of the Revolution.
All right.
We often hear about the men who fought, but what about the women?
Yeah.
What were their contributions?
Well, it's fascinating because they weren't just passively waiting at home.
Right,
We're talking about women managing farms and businesses, yes,
right.
but also leading protests against economic hardship
Wow.
brought on by the war.
That's amazing.
And some even participated in combat disguised as men.
You think about Deborah Sampson,
Yes.
the woman who disguised herself as a man to fight in the Continental Army.
Exactly.
What does that tell us about the times?
Her story and others, it really reveal a lot about the limitations placed on women,
Yeah.
but also their determination to break free from those constraints.
Of course.
Imagine the courage it took to defy societal norms and risk everything for the cause.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's incredible.
And it wasn't just on the battlefield, right?
Right.
This period also saw the emergence of women like Abigail Adams,
Yes.
who famously advocated for women's rights in her letters to her husband, John Adams.
Absolutely. Abigail Adams boldly questioned why women should be excluded from the new government's considerations.
Wow.
Think about that. During a time of immense upheaval, they were already planting the seeds
Yeah.
for future women's rights movements.
That's really cool.
It is.
So the revolution didn't lead to instant equality,
No.
but it did spark a conversation that would resonate for generations to come.
Exactly. It's crucial to understand that the revolution wasn't just about independence from Britain. It also raised questions about equality within American society itself.
All right.
And while immediate changes were limited, some states did see shifts in their laws.
Okay.
For example, making divorce easier for women to obtain.
So the war is independence is declared.
Yes.
But now the hard part begins.
Now what?
Building a new nation from scratch.
Right.
How do you even start to create a government unlike anything that came before?
Well, this is where the concept of republicanism takes center stage.
Okay.
You can think of it as a system where power flows from the people,
Okay.
not a king or a hereditary ruling class.
Gotcha.
It's a radical departure from the monarchy they just fought to overthrow.
So a government by the people for the people.
Yes.
Sounds simple enough,
Yes.
but I imagine the reality was a bit more complicated
You're absolutely right.
than that. The Declaration of Independence famously declared that all men are created equal,
Right.
but the reality was far messier.
Many groups,
Like,
women, Native Americans, those without property were still excluded from full participation in this new republic.
yeah?
It exposed the inherent contradictions at the heart of this bold experiment.
And speaking of building a new nation,
Yes.
let's talk about the creation of state governments.
Okay.
How did they go about establishing these brand new systems of governance?
This is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
One of the most innovative things they did was to embrace written constitutions,
Okay.
unlike Britain,
Yeah.
which operated on an unwritten constitution
Ah.
based on tradition and precedent.
Right.
The American states decided to codify their governing principles
Yeah.
in clear written documents.
So transparency was key.
It was.
They wanted the rules of the game laid out for everyone to see.
Exactly.
But did this translate to truly democratic governments at the state level?
Well, they were certainly concerned with limiting executive power.
Oh, okay.
Many states imposed strict checks on their governors to prevent the emergence of a tyrant.
Gotcha.
They were determined to avoid replicating the very system they had just fought to break free from.
Checks and balances in action.
Yeah.
So they were taking steps to prevent the concentration of power in the hands of one person.
Precisely. But what's fascinating is that full-blown democracy wasn't the ultimate goal.
Right.
For many of these early states,
Interesting.
property requirements for voting were common, mirroring aspects of the British system they had just rejected.
Wow.
It shows that the transition to a truly inclusive republic was a gradual
Yeah.
and often contradictory process.
Makes you wonder, what did those who fought for independence think of this new system?
Yeah.
Did it live up to their expectations?
It's a question worth pondering.
For sure.
And speaking of fascinating contradictions, Remember the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780.
Refresh my memory.
Okay.
What made it so special?
Well, for one, it pioneered the idea of a constitutional convention, a dedicated assembly solely focused on drafting the state's constitution.
Okay.
This became a model for the U.S. Constitution itself.
Really?
Yes,
Yeah.
but it also granted the governor surprisingly strong powers,
Interesting.
which might seem counterintuitive
Yeah.
given their emphasis on limiting executive authority.
So a blend of innovation and a touch of the old ways.
Exactly.
It seems like they were still figuring things out as they went along.
Absolutely. There was no blueprint for building a republic.
Right.
So they were experimenting, adapting,
Yeah.
and sometimes even contradicting themselves
Of course.
as they navigated this uncharted territory.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It was a new world for everybody.
A time of great experimentation for sure. And one of the most significant experiments was the Articles of Confederation.
Okay.
It was America's first attempt at a national government.
Right.
But as you might know, it had its fair share of problems.
Yeah. It's often portrayed as a failure.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
But what was the thinking behind it? What were they trying to achieve with this first government?
Adopted in 1777,
Okay.
it was essentially a continuation of the pre-independence structure,
Okay.
a loose alliance of states
Okay.
where the states retained a lot of power.
Gotcha.
Think of it as a league of friendship
Okay.
rather than a unified nation.
Okay.
They were wary of centralized power,
Yeah.
having just fought a war to break free from a strong central authority.
So a reaction to their experience with British rule.
Yes.
But what were some of the specific issues that arose under the Articles of Confederation?
Yeah.
What made it ultimately unsuccessful?
Well, the biggest issue was the lack of real power at the national level.
Go.
Congress, under the Articles, couldn't directly tax the states.
Oh.
It had to rely on them to contribute funds voluntarily,
Uh-huh.
which, as you can imagine, didn't always work out so well.
So they couldn't effectively raise revenue to fund essential services or a national military?
Right.
That sounds like a recipe for instability.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Imagine trying to govern a nation
Uh-huh.
where the central government can't enforce its own laws
Right.
or raise the funds needed to operate effectively.
For sure.
It was a constant struggle,
Yeah.
especially when it came to things like maintaining a standing army
Right.
or paying off war debts.
And speaking of struggles, winning independence didn't magically solve all their problems
No,
on the international stage either, right?
you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
The post-war period was full of diplomatic challenges.
Like what?
For instance, even though the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783,
Uh-huh.
the British continued to occupy forts in the Northwest Territory,
Oh, really?
land that was supposed to be ceded to the United States.
It seems like they were still dealing with the remnants of British influence,
Yes,
even after winning the war.
exactly. And it wasn't just the British.
Oh, okay.
The young nation faced difficulties with other European powers as well.
Okay.
Take Spain, for example.
Okay.
They controlled the mouth of the Mississippi River, which was crucial for American trade,
Yeah.
especially for those in the Western territories.
So access to the Mississippi was a major economic issue. How did they navigate that?
Well, in 1786, they managed to negotiate a treaty with Spain,
Okay.
but it was a controversial one.
In what way?
While Spain acknowledged American claims on the Florida border,
Uh-huh.
they also insisted on maintaining control over the Mississippi River for 25 years.
So a mixed bag.
Yeah.
Some gains, but also some significant concessions.
Right.
How did people react to this treaty?
Southern states, particularly those reliant on the Mississippi for trade, were furious.
Really?
They felt it was a betrayal of their interests.
Wow.
The treaty ultimately failed to get ratified,
Oh, wow.
highlighting the regional divisions that were already emerging within the young nation.
So external conflicts, internal divisions.
Yeah.
Seems like the challenges were piling up.
They were.
But let's shift gears for a moment
Okay.
and talk about westward expansion. It was a defining aspect of early American history,
Sure.
but it also brought about a whole new set of complexities.
Absolutely. And to understand how the nation approached westward expansion, you have to look at the Northwest Ordinances,
Okay.
a series of laws passed by Congress that laid out the framework for governing the territories
Uh-huh.
west of the Appalachian Mountains.
Okay. Break it down for me.
Yeah.
What were the key features of these ordinances?
Right.
What were they designed to do?
Well, the first ordinance, the Ordinance of 1784, was actually proposed by Thomas Jefferson.
Oh, wow.
His vision was to divide the Western Territory into self-governing districts
Okay.
that could eventually apply for statehood.
Okay, so a plan for organized expansion.
Yes.
But what about the Native American tribes
Yeah.
who already lived in these territories?
Right.
How did these ordinances address their rights and claims to the land?
That's a crucial question, and it's where things get complicated.
Okay.
While the ordinances did call for fair treatment of Native Americans and required treaties to be negotiated for land cessions,
Right.
the reality on the ground was often quite different.
So a gap between good intentions and actual practices.
Yes.
What happened in practice?
Sadly, the government often failed to uphold those treaties.
Really?
Expansion led to conflict and displacement,
Yeah.
and Native Americans were often pressured into giving up their lands under duress.
That's awful.
There were notable exceptions, of course. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787, for example,
Okay.
included some groundbreaking provisions,
Okay.
freedom of religion,
Well.
right to trial by jury,
Yeah.
and most notably a prohibition on slavery in the new territories.
That's a significant step. So they were taking a stance against the expansion of slavery into the Western territories.
Yes, though, the fight over slavery would continue to plague the nation for decades to come.
Right.
It highlights the complexities and contradictions of this period, striving for ideals of equality
Yeah.
while simultaneously grappling with the legacy of injustice.
And speaking of complexities, the westward expansion also led to conflicts
Yes,
with Native American tribes, right?
absolutely.
What were some of those?
The Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794 is a stark example.
Okay.
General Anthony Wayne led American forces to a decisive victory against a confederation of Native American tribes, resulting in the Treaty of Greenville in 1795.
Another treaty. Did this one stick?
Well,
Did it bring lasting peace to the region?
it did cede significant lands to the United States.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is that it also, at least for a time, recognized the sovereignty of Native American tribes
Really?
over their remaining territory.
Yeah.
This acknowledgement was a significant departure from the prevailing view
Yeah.
that saw Native Americans as subjects to be conquered.
So a glimmer of recognition, but ultimately the pressure for westward expansion continued to drive conflict and displacement.
Sadly, that's the case.
Yeah.
The Treaty of Greenville proved to be a fragile peace. The demand for land resources and expansion fueled further encroachment on Native American lands, leading to a cycle of violence and dispossession.
It's a reminder that the story of westward expansion is not a simple one of progress and manifest destiny.
Right.
It's a story intertwined with conflict, broken promises, and the struggle for survival.
Exactly. And it's important to acknowledge the enduring impact of these historical events on Native American communities today.
Right.
Their legacy continues to shape the relationship between the United States and indigenous nations.
So we've seen the challenges of governing a new nation, the complexities of diplomacy, the push for westward expansion.
Yes.
But there's another event that really exposed the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation.
Yeah.
Shays' Rebellion.
Right.
What can you tell us about it?
Shays' Rebellion was a pivotal moment in early American history.
Yeah.
It really brought to light
Yeah.
the shortcomings of the Articles of Confederation.
Okay.
It's often seen as a catalyst for the eventual shift towards a stronger national government.
So let's set the stage.
Okay.
What led to this rebellion?
Right.
Who was involved and what were they fighting for?
Imagine you're a farmer in Massachusetts.
Okay.
In the aftermath of the Revolutionary War,
Okay.
you're struggling with debt, high taxes,
Yeah.
and the threat of losing your land.
Oh, wow.
This was the reality for many,
Yeah.
and their frustrations were reaching a boiling point.
Economic hardship can breed unrest, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So who emerged as a leader
Right.
of this growing discontent?
A former Continental Army captain,
Right.
Daniel Shays, stepped forward as a leader of this movement.
Okay.
He and his followers, many of whom were veterans themselves,
Right.
felt betrayed by the government they had fought to establish.
Wow.
They demanded debt relief,
Uh-huh.
fairer tax policies,
Yeah.
and an end to the practice of imprisoning people for debt.
So they were essentially fighting for economic justice.
Yeah.
And what they saw as their rightful due after sacrificing for their nation,
Right.
what actions did they take?
Okay.
How did this unrest manifest itself?
They didn't just petition the government.
No.
They took direct action.
What did they do?
They organized protests,
Okay.
disrupted court proceedings to prevent foreclosures,
Wow.
and even attempted to seize weapons from the Springfield Armory.
That's a bold move.
It was.
So they were willing to take up arms against the very system they had helped create.
Right.
How did the government respond to this rebellion?
The Massachusetts State Militia was called in to suppress the rebellion.
Okay.
And after several skirmishes, they were successful.
So they were able to put it down.
They were.
But the fact that it even came to this armed rebellion against the government
Yes.
sent shockwaves through the nation?
It did.
It must have been a wake-up call for those who believed in the viability of the Articles of Confederation.
Absolutely.
If the government couldn't even maintain basic order. It was clearly time for a change.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Shays' Rebellion, while ultimately unsuccessful,
Right.
exposed the fragility of the young nation
For sure.
and the inadequacy of the Articles of Confederation in addressing internal crises.
Wow.
It became a powerful argument for those advocating for a stronger,
Yeah.
more centralized government.
So Shays' Rebellion, while short-lived,
Yeah,
had a lasting impact on the course of American history.
did too.
It highlighted the urgent need for a system
Right.
that could effectively address economic grievances,
Yes,
maintain order, and unify the nation under a stronger central authority.
precisely.
Okay.
And this growing realization paved the way for the Constitutional Convention in 1787,
Okay.
where delegates from the states gathered to address the shortcomings of the Articles of Confederation.
Right.
It was a turning point
Yeah.
that led to the creation of the United States Constitution,
Right.
the very foundation of American governance that we know today.
So from the sacrifices of women during the Revolution
Yeah.
to the challenges of building a new republic
Right.
and the turmoil of events like Shays' Rebellion,
Uh-huh.
we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
What's the one key takeaway
Yeah.
you hope our listener will walk away with?
I think the most important thing to remember is that this period was a time of immense change,
Okay.
experimentation, and ultimately compromise.
Yeah.
The founders were brilliant minds,
Yes.
but they were also navigating uncharted territory.
Of course.
They had to balance competing interests, lofty ideals,
Right.
and the practical realities of governing a diverse and rapidly expanding nation.
And that's the beauty of studying history, isn't it?
It is.
It's not just about memorizing dates and names.
Right.
It's about understanding the messy, complex,
Yeah.
and often contradictory process of how we got to where we are today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a journey of discovery that challenges us to think critically about the past,
Right.
to appreciate the struggles and triumphs of those who came before us, and to recognize that the quest for a more perfect union is an ongoing process, one that continues to this very day.
Well said.
Thank you.
Thanks for taking us on this fascinating journey through early American history.
My pleasure.
It's been an enlightening deep dive.
I agree.
And to our listener, we hope you've enjoyed this exploration of the American Revolution and the birth of a nation.
Yes.
Keep those thinking caps on.
Right.
And we'll see you next time for another deep dive.